Welcome to the 7th installment of the Q&NE expansion video series. In this video, we are going to actually complete almost all of the roadbed and track for the mainline and the paper mill yard, and we're going to do an operating road test and clearance check. And for the structures buff, we are going to actually start putting together some important structures that help us set the tone for the paper mill power supply. We'll also go over the poll that we had in our last video and give you another opportunity to weigh in on some track plan design decisions that still have to be made. And like always, here's a before and after look, taking us from where we were at the end of the last video to where we'll be at the end of this video. Well, sadly, we only had 13 people who felt moved enough to vote on the questions asked on the last video out of 4,000 plus viewers. But nevertheless, I did promise to let you know what the results were. And here we have them. I think it was unanimous that everyone preferred the curved single switch lead, so we won't dwell on that. Similarly, nobody voted to keep the locomotive service facility in place, so we're going to assume that everyone's for some version of a coal operation. There was certainly a lot of interest in the idea of coal operations through the backdrop, either as a stub end or as an unloading loop for unit trains. But we're going to go through reasons why in the end I chose not to do that. What we are doing, represented here as option 4, is to replace the wood chip stockpiles with the coal stockpiles, and we'll be running conveyor belt system from the coal unloader to the stockpiles, and then from the stockpiles to a head house, and the head house over to the power plant. The wood chip stockpiles will be represented by hopefully photos on the backdrops. Okay, so bear with me here. You'll have to use your imagination a little bit. This is what the backdrop kind of will look like, or where it'll be located. And you have to imagine now what it would look like had we tried to have a balloon track or even a track through the backdrop at the higher level. I don't think there would be an easy way to camouflage the difference in elevation for the balloon track above to the main line below. Furthermore, I really wasn't keen on having to give up an entire brand new staging track for a coal train that would be run once an operating session. That plus the cost of more motive power and 30, 40, I don't know how many cars that I'd have to buy for coal, it really fell down on my list of need to have. So what are we going to do here to hide this transition through the backdrop? So I came upon this idea of using the power plant as a view block and then having the coal head house and conveyors sort of framing the opening, which will later dress up with additional pipes going across between the buildings. We'll take a more detailed look at this a little later on in the video. In order to make the connection between the old layout and the new expansion, I had to first expose some of the old roadbed beneath the end of track, and this was simple enough, using a little bit of water and a spray bottle and working the ballast loose. I then had to dig through my old box of leftover cork for a piece that was a little bit thicker than what I'm using here. I'm using 3mm for the most part in the extension, but the original layout was much thicker. That meant creating a transition piece by shaving one end of a 6 or 8 inch piece so that the two pieces of roadbed would match. And here you see it installed. And from that point on, it was just business as usual, continuing with the 3mm cork roadbed. I removed some of the original ties and scraped the end of the rails clear of any paint that was on it so that the new rail joiners would make good contact. I also remembered to drill a hole for the switch machine, for the number 8 switch that leads to the branch up to the paper mill. And by incredible coincidence, or maybe just my excellent estimating powers, I used up the last 3 pieces of flex track, the Atlas flex track, in the hidden area here, so that all future track on the visible portion of the layout would be using the more realistic looking, I think, micro engineering Code 83 flex track. Before any further track and roadbed could be installed, I needed to finish off the sub roadbed, which, as you recall from the last video, we had left a piece of it unfinished while we were thinking about whether or not we wanted to have this grade down to the main line or have a stub-ended switching lead or balloon track for coal unloading. I carefully marked off the quarter points of this quarter turn and measured the difference in elevation and tried to make them equally spaced so that the grade was consistent, using the same techniques I used in the last video, measuring and putting wedges in to hold it in place while I screwed in the brackets. Here we see the last of the mainline roadbed and a bit of the roadbed that runs up the grade to the beginning of the mill yard lead. Again, coincidentally, I had cut just enough cork strips to take me to this very point, and the next decision will be, do I put cork roadbed under the yard or have it more low profile sinking into the mud? More on that later. Just my luck, as I was building the mainline track from the portal up to the backdrop where the 2 parts met, I was off by 1/8 of an inch. No stretching could fix that, so I had to install a splice piece of micro engineering track. No sooner than I had completed the main line than I realized, oops, I forgot to put in some super elevation. I had done this on my original layout, and it really makes for a nice effect to see that slight canting of the trains as they go around the curves. Simple job, small slice of cardboard does the trick on one side of the rail only. And so this is the moment we've all been waiting for. Can we run a train on the new extension of the layout? And I assembled a test train of the longest cars and the tallest cars to check for clearance as I go. A pair of SD40s, a pair of cabooses, 2 multi-levels, and 1 5-pack of containers rounds out the train. The most amazing part of this test, other than the fact that there were no derailments, and the clearances were generally okay, and more on that later, was the fact that the entire extension in this other room on all 4 levels of track is powered completely by the connection the 2 rail joiners make at the wall between the 2 rooms. Of course, I will eventually install a 12-gauge bus, a feeder bus, to connect to all those dangling wire feeders that I soldered on a couple of videos ago. So not to worry, I will install that. It's a good practice, but just amazed that for now anyway, all the power is being nicely routed through all these joints without any boost from a power bus running along the main line. Here we see the train making its first test. Clearance-wise, it's entering the tunnel portal and we can see that there is a good ½ inch of clearance for those double stack containers. I have temporarily spiked all these number 8 turnouts because they don't have the spring action clip that the Walthers turnouts do. Entering the top level of the helix. Remember that the outside track of the 5 tracks you see here is the main line. Only the 4 inside tracks are actually storage or staging tracks. Now on the bottom level of the helix. And now entering the turning loop at the end of the line. Because the turning loop is electrically isolated, it had no way of getting power from the rest of the layout. I temporarily connected it to the other loose feeder wires that I had not yet connected to a bus, just to give it power to have the train enter into the loop. Once fully in the loop and come to a stop, I reversed the polarity on the turning loop so the train could exit on its own power without changing direction on the DCC controller. This is the same concept I use on my other 2 staging yards. I use a center off DP-DT switch to keep the staging yards basically unpowered when they're not being used, so there's no big drain on or power constantly running through all the locomotive decoders that are sitting in staging, and change the direction depending on whether the train is entering the staging or exiting staging. All trains exiting staging will be using this outside mainline track, which has the shallowest grade. It is a 39-inch radius, so it will be interesting to see whether I can cut back on some of my locomotive requirements for trains making it up the hill coming out of staging. Although there is more than adequate clearance for double stack container trains on the main line and the turning loop, the same cannot be said, unfortunately, about the 4 staging tracks. This is a direct consequence of the screw up I made when building the benchwork, and I described that issue a couple of videos ago. Had I started the helix turn 1/4 turn earlier, this wouldn't have been the case. Interestingly though, this is only an issue for the high cube domestic containers, not the ocean containers. One is 8 foot, one is 8'6", I think, and that slight difference makes the difference. This is only an issue at the very end of the staging tracks, and since they're unidirectional, the trains are always moving away from the edge of the plywood, so they can squeeze through. Now, while I can make some adjustments to the edge of the plywood and chip away at it a little bit, I don't think I'm going to bother, because more than likely any container trains headed to and from Montreal would use the turning loop as a staging area rather than one of the 4 general freight staging tracks. So not really worth the concern or effort. As I mentioned earlier, I had decided on using the coal plant and conveyor system as a means of camouflaging the 2 tracks that will be extending through the backdrop. The way this area is laid out, there's so much going on here, it really has a lot to draw your eye away from the wall, and I will still try and dress up the opening of the wall. If you happen to be standing right along the wall and looking in that direction, you will be able to see through the backdrop, but from almost every other angle you really can't see the backdrop between the buildings. So I think it's a fairly good use of structures and detail to divert your attention to other things. I have a fondness or habit of not building Walther's kits according to the instructions. There's nothing worse than having on your layout the exact same building in the exact same shape as everyone else who's bought the kit. So this is quite a different setup from the way the conveyor kit is advertised. And similarly for the power plant, I've turned the exhaust stack and the associated building 90 degrees to the rest of the structures, and I've unfolded the building somewhat, so because the building is up against the backdrop, there's a whole sheet from the kit that you can use against the backdrop over to the side, so it looks like another building, and that further enhances the illusion of depth and multiple buildings in the space. Another reason for turning the exhaust stack 90 degrees to the rest of the structure is because I wanted to open up some more space for a large pulp mill building immediately adjacent to it, because I have 2 tracks coming in with tank cars and whatnot. So I wanted to make sure I had enough room for a fair size pulp mill. From this angle and photo, you can see I've added a Kleenex box just to give you a sense of the coal unloading shed that the hopper cars will be pushed through this area. Again, providing more detail and something to distract your eye from the fact that the 2 tracks are curving off behind the building into the backdrop. The old Walther's Shinohara curved turnout that I've had for 20 some years that I was thinking of using here is 28 inside inch radius and 32 inch outside radius. And while it does provide for a nice smooth flow in terms of track radii, I'm concerned about the age of the turnout and the fact that it wasn't designed for DCC, and I'd have to do a fair bit of work to make sure it's electrically compatible for DCC. It also takes up a hell of a lot of space. It's a very long turnout. It would result in the switch points the switch stand being right at the top of the hill. I wasn't really crazy about the track, running away from the yard right after the point of switch. So I took a look at the Walters, the new Walters curved turnouts. Closest one I could find has a nice broad outside radius of 36 inches, but the inside radius is only 24 inches. So a bit of a compromise, but it's really a much shorter turnout, so its footprint is pretty good. I did have to play around with exactly where I wanted to place it because I have a roadway crossing plan from the outside of the first track, kind of the arrival departure track, into the inside of the yard, and it would cross the point of switch because it's such a short turnout compared to the Walters turnout, or I have to relocate the road. In the end, that's what I decided to do. I think there's enough room to shift the road crossing just beyond the point of switch, and that effectively would be a good place to have the break in grade where the track starts descending towards the main line. So in this photo you see I've made the commitment, continued on with setting out the turnout locations. I also decided to cut up some more cork strips and have the yard on ballast, 3mm roadbed. The rest of the industrial tracks will likely not be ballasted to give it that difference in elevation that is common with industrial trackage. So off I went on my merry way, building out the rest of the mill yard. And then I started pushing some of my cars around just to move them out of the way. And lo and behold, when they run through this beautiful brand new curved turnout, they were derailing. There's a huge gap in the gauge of the closure rails. It was shocking. I traced the problem to the closure rails, or at least the portion of the closure rails that had ties, that had spikes in the ties. It seems that Walters designed in a fair bit of play so that that rail could slide left and right or backwards and forwards. The quick fix was to, hammer in a small nail to shove the rail up against the tie spikes. Needless to say, I have been in touch with Walters. They've been very gracious, and customer service is number one. They offered to send me a replacement, but I've asked them to double check and see if it's in fact a design error, whether all of them are the same, or it's a production error where for some reason the spikes are loose. Anyway, I will follow up in my next video, but for now I'm not throwing out my old Shinohara turnout so quickly. I can always make the change to reinstate it after having converted it to DCC. While I'm on the subject of production quality, I thought I'd give you an update on my observations of microengineering track. I always thought they were the most realistic looking and best flex track for handling any kind of curve that you want to set because it holds its shape. A minor quibble is that they seem to have stopped providing drill holes near the ends of each track on the outside of the rails along the ties. Not a big deal, of course, now because I've got a pin vise and I can drill holes wherever I want, but it's just a curiosity that they've stopped providing those drill holes. My big concern with the latest production run of a microengineering flex track is that I don't know whether it's their machines that have gotten worn out after so many years, but there are way too many spots along each piece of flex track where the spikes just don't exist. So what's holding the rail in gauge? It's really a scary thought given that what we're paying for these pieces of flex track. to have to come in and add spikes later, it's not on. It's not something we should have to do. So I haven't done anything about it. I've only just noticed it, but it's a concern. Just a quick note here about the different sizes of track nails that I've been using throughout construction here. Going from right to left, the largest type of nail is a 5/8 inch nail, generally used for holding down the cork roadbed. The middle nail is generally the track nails that I got from Atlas that are used to fix down all the flex track that in the hidden staging yards, basically all the Atlas track. The one on the left is actually called a Pico, a track pin. It gets that name because it is literally a pin. It's softer than the others, so you have to be careful when you're installing them because they tend to bend or break easily. But they're the best for micro-engineering track because they're the most unobtrusive. You generally don't notice them once they're in. Another interesting comparison are the rail joiners. The one on the top is the Walters Code 83, and I use them for all the Atlas flex track because you can't see them, so it's not a big deal in the hidden staging area that they're so long. The one in the middle are the they're Micro Engineering Code 83, so they're meant to fit the micro engineering track, and they're much shorter and almost invisible when you get them on. By accident, I have a Code 70 sample that was mixed in with my bag, and it's interesting how small they can get for Code 70 rail. The challenge, of course, is getting the smaller cross-section micro-engineering joiners to fit onto the slightly larger cross-section of the Walters turnouts. It can be done, of course. You just need to open up the ends ever so slightly with a sharp pair of pliers, and then once you get it on just a little bit, you can push against, say, the end of the plywood, which is sort of soft, and slowly drive it on. You may recall from a much earlier video that I had to use a shim underneath the Walters turnouts because the ties have such a smaller cross section when compared to the Atlas flex track. Interestingly enough, these ties are roughly the same cross section as the micro engineering turnouts, so for the visible part of the layout, I do not need a shim under the Walters turnouts. And this is the one location on the layout where the micro engineering track has to meet the Atlas track, where there is that slight difference, but it's in an area where I can use a very short shim if necessary to bridge the height difference. This is just outside of the tunnel portal. An interesting observation about the new Walters turnouts is that they give you 24 pre-drilled holes to insert your track pins. This makes it very useful when you're cutting up turnouts to make crossovers. There are holes on either side of each rail at the ends of the tracks and on either side of the frog. So very useful for keeping the two halves of your crossovers perfectly aligned. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at why we need to cut up the turnouts to make a crossover. Typically, for crossovers, the spacing between the main tracks are about 14 feet in real life. That works out to about 2 inches in HO scale. If you butt the turnouts end to end, you get a very wide track spacing, something on the order of 3 inches. Not realistic. In my case, it isn't a mainline crossing, but I didn't want the tracks so far apart because it pushes the one track too close to the building and makes for an unacceptable radius for the track entering the coal unloading shed. It also has a domino effect by bumping into the next turnout in line. If you have a lot of turnouts on your lead, it shoves the next one down. And if the next one is meant to serve a particular location in the layout, Or is it self-constrained by a following turnout? That doesn't work. So your turnouts have to overlap. The question is, by how much? For the new Walters turnouts, you're constrained somewhat by where the jumpers have been installed underneath the ties. I chose to remove the last 6 ties on the turnout, leaving one full tie between my cuts and the jumper wires. This results in a track spacing of 2 1/4 inches, which is just fine for my industrial application. It's not a mainline crossover. Plus, it gives me a little bit extra room to throw in a switch stand where the points are. Once you make the cuts in the 4 long ties, it's an easy thing to jiggle the ties and slowly slide them off. The process is repeated for the second turnout. However, you'll notice when you overlay the 2 turnouts, something looks odd with the ties. And this is because this is not a regular crossover where you have a left-hand to left-hand turnout. In this case, it's a left-hand to right-hand turnout, so the long ties don't match. The solution to this is to cut off the ties that are at an angle, the 6 ties at an angle, and replace them with the ties, the straight ties that were cut off from the normal route of the second turnout. And don't forget to cut off the little nibs that are left over from your original cut, as you'll need some room to play to adjust the ties so that they line up perfectly with the other ends of the long ties from the first turnout. The final step is to take one of the leftover ties, scrape off the spike detail, and slip it in the wide open space between the ties. And here you see the resulting 2 1/4 inch track spacing. Oops, almost forgot. There is one more tiny step, and that is to trim off a very small piece of the end of one tie because the ties, the long straight ties, overlap very slightly. I then set about to build a second crossover at the other end of the same tracks, only to realize that with a 2 1/4 inch track spacing, I'd have to pull up the cork and track that I had laid because I laid it at 2 inch spacing. One of my minor pet peeves about the Walters turnouts is that they only included tie extensions or head blocks for one side of the points. It's always on the diverging side. So in a yard ladder arrangement, you always want to have your switch stands on the outside of the ladder, but you can't with these turnouts, so you have to cut them off and reposition them on the other side of the points. And here you see how I've done that. So as we come to the end of another video in this series, here is a look at where we stand now. I kind of like the way this power plant and coal unloading conveyor system works. And you can see I've started to lay out some of the other tracks, industrial sidings that will serve the paper mill. But I've left myself with one open question. As you see here, there appears to be another track diamond in the making. It's not in the original plan. And so this is one of the questions for you, the viewers. This is roughly the track plan that you've seen before. It's a switchback arrangement to serve the tank and cover hopper spots at the pulp mill, and one reverse move here to switch in chlorine. And the tail track or pullback area is where the loads of inbound recycled paper will be unloaded. The alternative arrangement that we're talking about here is to move the switchback operation actually down to the 4th yard track and have that switchback operation take place within the yard. It's still a switchback move, but it would take place in the yard, perhaps more logically, and it would free up the track for the inbound recycled paper to not have to be double switched. It wouldn't have to be sort of a double purpose of being used as a switchback as well as a car spot. It would also eliminate the need to run the track through the backdrop to serve as a pullback. I could still run the track through the backdrop if I wanted to increase the capacity, if I wanted to spot more cars for unloading. I think I've got enough already, but it allows for that possibility. So that's it then for this month's video. Do let me know your thoughts on which of the two scenarios have more promise or are preferable. I think I know what I'm going to do, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Here then is just a quick drone view of where we are now. Here's a little teaser for some of what you might see in our next video. See you then. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoy layout improvement videos, here are a few others that you may find interesting. If you're not already a subscriber, you can click on the logo on the top right-hand corner of your screen.